Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always my pleasure.
Charles, for the sake of time, let's just kind of jump right in. I put out a number of videos throughout 2019 that have attempted to explain what is both driving market momentum and, in my opinion, what continues to hold the equity markets up. What I thought we would do today is for me to kind of very briefly highlight some of the key charts from those videos, simply as a launching pad for a discussion of how they fit with your own research and your writings and your views. The two most recent videos are shown here, and for those who haven't seen them, can be found and viewed at matasii.com, our website, or at the Macro Analytics YouTube channel. Charles, please jump in as I step through the highlight charts here. Since our 111 pages, as I recall, 2017 thesis paper on the illusion of growth, it has been very clear to us at MetaSII that the slowing rate of real global economic growth is a central problem globally that is not fully understood as regards monetary, fiscal, and public policies of governments around the world. And as a result, policies have incorrectly addressed the symptoms, not the cause, in a fashion that we have used cheap credit in various forms of monetary malpractice, the terminology we use, to address the perceived economic problems resulting from this. And this has led to a corporate response in the form of massive debt for equity swaps, or what is labeled as corporate stock buybacks. Buybacks have almost completely, as this chart shows, dominated the volume of buying of equities since that 2008 financial crisis. And this year will be another record for corporate buybacks. When you couple this with a dramatically shrinking public stock pool, it's little wonder that stock prices simply keep rising despite valuations and underlying fundamentals. In 1996, even prior to the explosion in IPOs associated with the dot-com bubble, there were already 8,025 publicly listed companies trading in the U.S. But by 2016, that number had fallen to 4,333, or 46% drop in 20 years, and is even lower today. That's the available stocks that you can actually flood all this increased money and credit into. And secondly, we have significant takeaways from that stock float associated with insider trading restrictions. That is a shockingly large restriction list, which continues to grow in size, thereby reducing further the public trading float pool. Add on top of that, private equity purchases of the top four players now total over $1 trillion, with the industry having over 10 trillion of investable assets, and a huge amount of that money is in publicly traded companies and is actually outside the eligible stock pool based on insider trading restrictions, which further reduces the number of stocks that are actually available to purchase. Thirdly, we have the stock buybacks, which we just mentioned, which have further reduced available shares of that shrinking stock pool by, and I totaled it up, about $3.5 trillion in the last 5.5 years, and more than $1 trillion in 2018 alone. And this number is forecast, as I said, to be even higher in 2019. Not insignificantly, in addition, if there's one last point I can make on this slide, we have major disincentives to actually go public. That is, fewer and fewer IPOs in the United States, at least, which is another major factor that has emerged since the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Any comments so far, Charles?
Yeah, I think you've done an excellent overview of why the pool of shares available to the public is declining. And then I just thought we'd maybe give an example. Like if you had a company that had 1 million outstanding shares and $1 million in net profit, that would be $1 of earnings per share, right? Well, if the company buys back 500,000 of their shares, there's only 500,000 shares left. Now, their sales and their profits haven't moved, but suddenly the earnings per share has doubled from $1 to $2. And now everybody looking from the outside who's not aware of the impact of the share buyback, they would assume that, oh my gosh, their profits have doubled, right? Because now their earnings per share is $2 instead of $1. And it's like, no, their sales and profits were stagnant, but the illusion of growth that you described is also very prevalent in what the consequence of the share buybacks and the reduction in public shares. It's like it's the illusion that profits are rising when it's just a reduction in the number of shares.
In a significant fashion. Absolutely true. Everybody's chasing yield today, and they're actually chasing the dividend generating stocks that are out there that have decent dividends. As you reduce the number of shares, the amount of money allocated for dividends is suddenly a much higher percentage, which makes them more attractive for those who are chasing the yield. And that's the case in a lot of the pension plans. It's driving it. And as a side point, additionally, besides the prices, the corporations have to do this. And this is why this is going to continue. Because you don't have growth, you've got to drive the profits up, or perception we just talked about. But at the same time, you're exposed to being taken over. If you got cash on your books, you're a takeover candidate. What you want to do is you want to have lots of debt. So they're incurring debt in a huge way, which is dirt cheap for them to finance and use that money to buy back. So it's increasing debt, making them less of a takeover candidate to buy back their shares, which generates all the things you were just talking about. To take over another company is their share price, which makes them able to go out and capture other companies that are emerging. And I would argue, and we're getting a little off track here, Charles, but the last point I make is that I would argue today that corporations can't find growth, so they're buying growth. That is, rather than make it, they're buying it. So they're using their stocks to go out and acquire a company. And acquire somebody, not a loser, because that takes risk. So anybody that looks like they've really got a potential, they use their stocks to buy them out. Even if they're not even public, they haven't went public. They offer the owners of the company stocks in their company, which are quite valued. So the point I'm making is we're trapped into a mechanism now going forward that's almost assured what we've had before is going to continue. And even if the rate of takeovers, or rather stock buybacks, slows, and it's hard to see that happening with interest rates and bond prices going down in terms of yield going forward, allowing them to even borrow more money. This mechanism says it's going to, in my opinion, going to continue to assist in driving this Minsky melt-up. All of this, Charles, is resulting in a new form of, my opinion, we call a Minsky melt-up. Our opinion is we see another corrective consolidation is about to happen here, foreseeable in relatively the near term. Here at the level we show is the C level. We've already had one corrected at this point. We feel there is still a lot after this is finished and we move off. We still think there's one more, or at least another lift, or a lot more to go over the next few years, especially as the powers to be and the governments are going to change, as they always do, the rules, the regulations, and the laws to keep the financial system from potentially imploding. Charles, remember in 2008, the financial crisis, and we came out of it, it wasn't just printing money. You recall the biggest change to save the banks was we used to have a concept called mark to market, right? Remember those days? And so all the assets of the banks had to be marked at a mark to market, what they were really worth. Well, they did away with that law at that point in time to help the banks. So it was a mark to magic, we called it, right? Mark to anything you want to make it. That was acceptable, which has profound implications to their asset requirements and their reserve requirements. And so fine, that got us out of the recovery. That law is still hasn't been implemented. So the banks are still at that point. And that's how you change laws and regulations. And then you eventually, there was a reason for having them. You get into really an unsound predicament. And I'm sure you observed it.
Oh yeah, and that's why I love your next slide, Trapped, the ensuing market roadmap,
Oh,
which puts it all together.
yeah, that's what we kind of were into what was going on and holding up the market. And we feel pretty strongly in that. But when you overlay it and it fits into this cycle of change and explode it, you can see why it's almost reinforcing and why the central banks are trapped. And in actual fact, many ways, the global economy is now trapped, and it's trapped in a system that's actually unstable. But you can keep fixing things until there's always a stability test in any cycle of change. And if you get through it and it's stable, you move on. But if it doesn't, it's unstable, things collapse and we reset. That's just part of the change mechanism. In our latest Under the Lens video, we argued that the cycle we showed previously, as I said, was only part of this cycle of change, and that almost assures this continual melt up as governments resort to things like buying stocks like Japan and others are already doing, and just other methods of propping up the market. We've unwittingly shifted to policies of unsound money shown here, which is now impairing the capitalist system and is resulting in creditism versus capitalism, or a capitalist system is being truly impaired. And Charles, for years you've written about this as the financialization of the global economy. And so we're doing saying the same thing with a little different terminology, but that's what's been going on. And this eventually is going to come to an end when the inevitable and this required stability test associated with any cycle of change arrives. And we're already seeing, in my opinion, early signs of this coming event. And we pointed all this out in this year's thesis of de-dollarization, the shifting, because the world is built on the dollar and the yield, the 10-year yield bond of the U.S. Treasury, which is considered risk-free. So all of the measurements of risk are against that 10-year bond, ever mind the currency it's denominated. You shake that, you shake the $500 to $600 trillion swaps market that's in currency and interest derivatives, which is a whole discussion for another day. There are, Charles, there are over 80 slides in those two videos that explode the hard facts. And I'm just quickly going over here behind our conclusions. But I would hope that our viewers would at least have a look at it on that. Charles, you sent me 7 points after you looked at the videos, and I thought we would kind of step through those in regards to these slides.
Right. Well, I want to start by just commenting on your chart here of the cycle, the roadmap of being trapped, and I think that the value here that I want to sort of emphasize is that the stock market, we often talk about it as if it's isolated from the global economy and from the credit markets and from policies and from currencies, but you're tying all these together. And I think that's really what one of the points I want our listeners to take away is that you can't isolate the stock market and say, oh, the stock market's soaring, so everything's wonderful. You have to look at what the system is using to create that melt up, which is credit, which, as you say, is changing capitalism by removing frankly, the fundamentals of capitalism. In other words, capital is supposed to earn a return. And so if you're getting negative yields on your bonds, something is extremely broken. And as you pointed out, that's creating instability that's being masked by various policies. And that eventually leads to a currency crisis, which really robs everyone. In other words, when the currency collapses or loses much of its value, it hurts everyone who owns that money and depends on that form of money. And so that's a very serious systemic outcome. And that's really what you're saying. It's already kind of baked in. And I think that's kind of the context of my comments.
It's baked in systemically, but it's also baked in because we don't even realize what the problem is. And now we're trapped in all sorts of issues, from unsound money to the currencies are inflated, etc. And so we don't even know what issues to address. And then we keep doing the same thing over and over. That is just assuming printing more money or extending more credit is going to solve the problem. And now we reach the point where more credit is actually hurting the system. And for those who believe, a strong stock market is a good sign, well, Zimbabwe and Venezuela, their markets were going through the roof as they and look how that worked out. It's because the currencies, when currency is going down, the stock price goes up because it takes a lot more money of that weakening currency to drive it up. And it's hard to see that currencies are weakening right now because if one currency goes down, the other's going up. But if everybody's debasing their currencies, it's hard to know where to go. Typically, it's been gold and silver, but it's been a proven fact that those have been manipulated markets for quite some time now to hide this illusion that's going on.
Yeah, and that's my number one point, which is that the illusion that that's being promoted in the media and by our policymakers is that having propped up the markets with various rule changes and expanding credit and so on that you covered, it doesn't mean we've actually fixed the problems. And so that's a big difference. Propping something up doesn't mean you've fixed it. It just means it kicked the can down the road, as we say, and increased the instability. And so I think part of what we're trying to explain here in this program is why has it required so-called emergency measures that were instituted in 2008 and 2009? Why are they still here? Why are those now the default policies a decade into this? And clearly they haven't fixed the system. And I use the phrase minimizing the pain to the wealthy elites, because when you prop up the stock market, that's a lot of the wealth of the financial elites and the political elites. And so rather than cleanse the system, which was what was needed in 2008 and 9, it was sort of like, well, we minimized the damage to the people that matter. But now that's the consequences of that are coming into focus, and they've weakened the whole system. And so now, as you're pointing out, we're trapped in these policies of zero interest rates or negative interest rates and constant intervention by central banks just to kind of keep the thing from keep it glued together. But this is crippling capitalism and our social contract, which is that opportunity is supposed to be equal. Maybe not the outcomes. They can't be equal, but the opportunity should be equal. But the huge increase in wealth and income inequality is shredding our social contract. And that matters.
Charles, the 2008 financial crisis, we put together a chart that said we would go through we expected to go through stages, and the financial crisis was exactly that. It was a financial issue, and it was primarily, though it spilled around the world, primarily a U.S. housing, U.S. credit finance problem. So a country-driven but financial. We said that what's going to happen with these policies that we were seeing unfold is that we were going to move to an era where there was going to be economic issues. And that's what we've been witnessing as we can't get growth and because of the policies that we went in, and of course the whole issue of illusion of growth, but we go to economic issues, and then they wouldn't be just country, it would be regional areas. And that way we saw the issues in Europe explode in 2012. And so we've seen those kinds of things. And we said that the third area that we would likely get to, and we would get to, would not be financial or economic. They would still be there. It would be political. And suddenly it would be the voters and the public, and that would happen on a global basis, not regional basis. And what prompted me to bring this up here is because of the point that you're making. What all these policies have led into, you mentioned social contract, have now left inequality in massive ways around the world between the rich and the poor. We've come into there are people doing extremely well and people who are destitute. Even here in America, the amount of homeless, the amount of people that can't get by on the wages, etc. It may not be in the media, but it's a fact. And those are all a consequence and are all a fact of this evolving roadmap that we're now truly entitled, locked into and can't change. Well, we can change it, but I don't think we're ready to bite the pills that would change it.
as you say, that's a political decision, and that we're not quite there yet. But as you say, we've been locked into these things, and they start like you can go back to the late 1960s. A lot of people look at the U.S. Getting off the gold standard. That's well known, but there were other changes of moving the goalposts and changing the rules as you described. For instance, the Social Security system used to have its own separate budget. It used to be separate from the general federal fund, and then that got combined. And so the government could then use the surpluses from Social Security to fund all this other spending. And so that's just one example of dozens. And so meanwhile, while they've been playing around with all these ways of maintaining the illusion of growth, productivity's stagnated, savings have stagnated, real inflation adjusted wages have declined. And so we've substituted all that decline in the real economy with credit. And you've pointed out that 1980 is a critical kind of watershed moment. And I'd like you to walk through these slides talking about that critical inflection point.
Yeah, Charles, because it gets back to your point about changing the rules. And this slide here, which is the interest rates. And for those who can remember, we had 19% kind of rates with Volcker as he tried to break the inflation problem we were having actually around the world, but certainly in America, what he was trying to address, because and so the interest rates went right through the roof. And ever since then, interest rates have steadily come down to the point now we're back close to zero bound, and we'll see again probably getting very close to it. But and before that, on the left at the bottom, I got a little triangle here of how, standards of when you have a capitalist system and you invest in you have savings. That's an old concept, and you invested into productive assets. What that all leads to is improved standards of living, and that's what it was up until basically 1980. But everybody doesn't understand what really changed in 1980. And up until that point, the global trade between international balance of payments between countries had to be settled in gold. We came off the gold standard, August 1972 with Nixon, because we weren't going to exchange the dollars for gold as it had been pegged as a standard. But that's a separate subject from actually settling your account of trade at the end of the year with other countries in gold settlements that had to be moved between countries. And what we did at that point is we actually then went to, in the United States controlled this really through the Bank of International Settlements. We went to a credit system in that we allowed balance of payments to be settled as credit, primarily the United States settling its account balances in credit or IOUs. And during this era is what exploded was, what exploded, as you can see in this chart here, is the whole financialization of the economy ever since then. Financial assets just exploded and are now 5.6 times the GDP. And it went in different stages, and you'll notice that each of these are marked by the crisis years. And there was a reason why what appeared in each of those crisis years. And this chart here shows just what happened to U.S. household asset net worth as a percentage of GDP as it went up from 1980, because all of a sudden we were taking down interest rates. And when you take down interest rates, everything gets cheaper. It's easier to consume. And this chart shows the amount of growth in credit up to north of $73 trillion in Q1 of this of this year in credit. But to me, this chart is really what it shows, because at the same point, this is where our trade deficit just went through the roof. We started a consumption economy, that we started borrowing for consumption, and consumption, which goes right into the GDP, kept the whole economy going. And so suddenly we weren't saving anymore, and putting back into productive assets. We were actually stripping out assets in many ways as we subsequently started offshoring, outsourcing, downsizing. 56 100,000 companies going to China in 2000 as we went down through when China came into the WTO. But the point is because we could settle our balances, our negative balances on credit, suddenly there was nothing stopping this cycle. We didn't have to, we could just keep borrowing theoretically, as opposed to having to really pay our bills. And that's the mechanism that we can't stop any longer, because we're now a credit-driven system. As I said, we're now no longer have capitalism. We've impaired it so badly that we only have creditism. Do those charts ring with you, Charles, as being pointing out the significance of what happened then?
Absolutely. And, we have often talked about long cycles, and many other people have too. And say the bond market cycle and of interest rates, these, if you look back over history, they tend to run for between 20, 30, maybe 35 years. And so we've been running almost 40 years now on this reducing interest rates and declining yields to create to substitute credit for actual improvements in income and productivity, and that cycle is about to turn. I mean, just sort of in general, we're seeing that we're gonna reach a point of diminishing returns where that long cycle is going to change, and it's several generations long. And so we all think, oh, it's permanent, right? Because it's been running for so long that many people can't recall an era in which interest rates went up, for example. But interest rates go up when you have to defend your currency, and so that's the kind of instability we're going to see in the next decade as this cycle ends. And wanted to speak to your points about the enormous expansion of the equity markets as a percentage of household net worth and of GDP. My point here is the policymakers have become dependent on extreme market valuations, and that we see this in say pensions. That pensions now depend on a sky high stock market because that's what they've been using to generate growth and capital gains to support pensions. And the consumer economy that you mentioned is also dependent on equities, because we have to recall that the top 10% of households in the U.S. Own over 80% of equities, right? And they also earn about 50% of the income, and they're responsible for 50% of consumer spending. So, this wealth effect is a critical element of consumer spending. If the top 10% sees their stock portfolios smashed by 30 or 40%, they quickly withdraw, borrowing more money, spending money, and then the consumer economy, declines rapidly as a result. So we're now trapped in the consumption economy has trapped us in keeping equity markets propped up. These decades of the Federal Reserve and other central banks propping up equity markets has created another illusion, not only of growth, but an illusion of risk-free speculation. In other words, that you can gamble and borrow tons of money and put it in stocks, and no worries, no risk, because the Fed has your back, right? And so that's all financial markets have inherent risk, right? You can't eliminate risk. And so that's a very dangerous illusion. As you say, things can turn very quickly. And to your point of what's holding the market up, I think there's a psychology we should mention here where there's a bullish momentum, that the market's been saved again and again. We were in our third equity bubble. And those people who own the bellwether stocks, such as Boeing and Apple, they're so widely held by institutions that also creates a sort of psychological sense of safety. In other words, well, no one else is going to sell these stocks, and so I can just keep them in my portfolio and as if there's no risk. And this, of course, those of us who are older remember the Nifty 50. And so we see that same concentration of wealth in a handful of stocks, which is inherently risky. My ending comment is to reinforce the point you just made, is that if we were in a truly expanding economy with equal opportunity, with rising real wages, with savings rising, with productive investments being made, the stock market would be rising organically. In other words, because companies were hiring more people and the people were making more money, and profits were rising because of productivity. But that's not the economy we have. We have a stagnating economy with declining savings, declining real earnings, declining productivity or stagnating productivity, and a winner take most economy. So this is truly an illusion, and I think that's where I want to just kind of end my comments. As you say, this is not a stable system. If the economy were healthy, it would be stable, but the economy is not healthy, and all we've done is kind of duct tape together the stock market as a signal. In other words, the powers that be are going to make stocks go up because that's the signal that they're hoping everybody's looking at, that the economy's healthy. But that's just really papering over all this other instability in the credit markets and currency flows that you've described as a totality, if you will. And that whole system, the risk is piling up big time.
As in the Roman day, when Rome was breaking down, it was the day of circus, bread and circuses, right, Charles? And that's how the government kept everybody, the populace, happy, or really their mind off the real issues at stake. Well, today we do the same thing. We're enamored with sports to the point of dominating the news. With the bread is replaced with all sorts of financial subsidies from the government and payment schemes and transfer payments and entitlements to offset real productive growth. And then the third thing is keeping the stock market up, because every night you look at it and the Dow's up and it says everything's good. So how could anybody that isn't paying attention would listen to two of us talking and they say, you two are crazy. Things have never been better on the surface if you believe the numbers to be valid. And I've went through we've done many presentations on what inflation games that are going on, how the deflators are being manipulated. I just mentioned a couple here in the show with mark to market on financial books and ratios. And so we keep changing the rules. And it's like playing a game with somebody, and every time they're losing, they cheat. And so, expect the government and the powers to be to cheat because they're locked in. So as much as we've kind of been a bit of a doom and gloom conversation here, this is actually the best time to ever invest because you know what they're locked into. And you know what they're going to have to do. So you can make some pretty good decisions, but it's not going to come without serious volatility, which is another form of risk. So, you really have to be on top of things. But I think there's going to be major fortunes made and lost in the next 10 years of historic proportions. We're out of time here, Charles. Any final comments you want to make as we wrap up here?
No, just I hope that our listeners will take away the point that the stock market doesn't work independently of everything else. So we're keeping our eye on yields, on bonds, and currencies, right? That they're all interlinked, and the risk doesn't disappear; it simply moves behind some other curtain. But as you say, volatility is one manifestation of the risk, and so. We just have to keep our eye on what's being hidden from us, which right now is a systemic risk.
Talk to you again in a month or so?
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon.